Okay, all right.
They have some upstairs.
Oh, okay.
Not so much for concept.
It's familiar, but
Yeah.
they had it upstairs?
They had it upstairs yesterday.
Yeah, in the afternoon.
When they replaced all the muffins with cookies.
I'm trying to fatten everybody up.
No,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah. I'm sugar on people.
And then the inevitable.
Yes.
And then there's the crust. For the 0-8 talk, yeah.
People come in and out during this, particularly in the children. They have, normally classes start at 7.
So, they're like,
Good morning. Welcome to the second day of the McMullen Sea Power Symposium. I am Mary DeCredico, Professor of History here at the U.S. Naval Academy, and welcome to our morning session on the Navy and the Civil War. Our panelists today will be presenting first Lieutenant Commander Dwight Hughes, who's a proud Naval Academy graduate from the class of 1967, a surface warfare officer. He holds a master's in political science and an MS in information systems management. He specializes in Civil War naval history and has published a number of works on it. Today, he will be talking about the soldier and the sailor, Admiral David B. Porter and Ulysses S. Grant. We'll start with
Tangled up in the technology. Okay, thank you very much. As recorded in his memoirs, Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter was ushered into the presidential office on a September day in 1862. He had just been promoted over several ranks and several more senior contemporaries to command the Navy's Mississippi River Squadron. I promised you, said Abraham Lincoln, that you should see Vicksburg fall, and now you shall do it. Porter's plans were simple: a large naval force, a strong body of troops, and patience were the only means. Not long ago, he told the president, Vicksburg easily could have been taken, but it is now a second Gibraltar, and the Navy alone could do nothing. Porter's memoirs introduce us to an underappreciated partnership: the new admiral commanding the U.S. Navy Mississippi River Squadron and the Major General USS Grant commanding the Army of the Tennessee. Given the unprecedented nature of riverine warfare, success would hinge on the personalities and the wills of these two commanders and their subordinates. Americans had no experience with extensive operations on inland waterways requiring specialized classes of war vessels commanded and manned by naval personnel cooperating with land forces. The U.S. Navy began the war with no shallow water warships, no tactics, no command structure, no infrastructure. Neither service was versed in the relatively new, less than half-century old, business of steam rivermen and river craft now swarming the heartland rivers. Below the commander-in-chief, there was no joint Army-Navy commander, no joint staff, and no protocols or mechanisms for directing joint operations. Officers of one service could issue no orders to an officer of the other service, respective rank notwithstanding. Most officers considered their professions as distinct domains of land and sea, bounded by the high tide mark. Military cultures with different organizations, different technologies and skills were required to cooperate within a common strategic framework. When service leaders failed to plan and execute together effectively, lost strategic opportunities and tactical missteps followed. Efficient partnerships produced hard-won victories, but it was a learning process. Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote teamed with General Grant to take Forts Henry and Donelson in February 1862, one of the Union's first and greatest strategic victories. His gunboats assisted at the Battle of Shiloh and helped capture the rebel fortress at Island No. 10. Foote's successor, Charles H. Davis, cleared the Mississippi down to Vicksburg through the battles of Plum Point and Memphis. In summer 1862, Admiral David G. Farragut captured New Orleans and surged his deep water squadron up the Mississippi to meet Davis's river squadron at Vicksburg, forming the most powerful river armada to date. Farragut bombarded the citadel and begged for Army help. But theater commander General Henry Halleck was not interested. Thus, to the consternation of President Lincoln, was strategic opportunity lost. Farragut was compelled by low water and low coal supplies to withdraw his squadron back down the river. Navy Secretary Gideon Welles groused to his diary, "Had the Army seconded Farragut and the Navy in July 1862, Vicksburg would have been in our possession. Flag Officer Davis had brought the squadron this far, but Welles was not happy with him. Davis was not an energetic, driving, fighting officer such as is wanted for the rough work on the Mississippi. He has not the vim, the dash, the recklessness, perhaps is the better word, of Porter. The river naval service is unique. The Army has fallen in love with the gunboats and wants them on every creek. The service requires great energy, great activity, and abundant resources. Porter is full of each, but is reckless, improvident, often too presuming and assuming. Porter's appointment is an experiment, and the results are not entirely certain." I assumed command of the Mississippi River Squadron at Cairo, Illinois in October 1862, wrote Porter. There were the sturdy ironclads that had fought their way from Fort Henry to Donelson, to Island No. 10, and destroyed the enemy's navy at Memphis. All had done good service under their gallant commanders and become famous in the annals of the Navy. Sturdy they were, but also hurriedly designed and constructed and far from invulnerable. There were the so-called timberclads, rapidly converted side wheelers armed with 5-inch oak planks to stop mini balls. Speculation was that they would be sunk by rebel shore batteries if not shaken to pieces by their own weapons. The timberclads would, nevertheless, see more hard combat than all other gunboats in the theater. The rest of the vessels under my command, continued Porter, were not very formidable, consisting of some side-wheel river steamboats and 3 or 4 tin clads. And This was the force with which the Navy was expected to batter down Vicksburg. On November 20th, 1862, Porter was enjoying a supper party aboard an Army steamboat when he first met Grant. A short, travel-worn person in civilian dress was ushered in and introduced as the general. Though evidently tired and hungry, Grant commenced business at once. Here in 20 minutes, Porter recalled, Grant unfolded his plan of the Vicksburg campaign involving transportation of over 100,000 men. According to Secretary Wells, the prickly new admiral had not been enthusiastic about working with Grant. Porter dreads and protests against association with any West Point general. Says they are too self-sufficient, pedantic, and unpractical. Porter was given to cliquism. But the new admiral was charmed by this unassuming soldier who fully involved a sailor in planning and readily accepted advice from him, a new experience for Porter. The general appeared eager to incorporate naval assets as integral combat and logistical arms. From Porter's memoirs, Grant and myself never indulged in long talks together, but it was only necessary for him to tell me what he desired, and I carried out his wishes to the best of my ability. Grant, in his plain, dusty coat, was, in my eyes, one more.
I think it keeps overlaying the text behind it.
No, it's not doing okay. The underlying text is supposed to disappear when the new one comes up. This is Porter talking about Grant. Grant in his plain dusty coat was, in my eyes, a greater general than the man who rides around all feathers and fuss. A historian of the Vicksburg campaign noted that Grant and Porter were a formidable combination, hyper-aggressive and strategically astute. One was a ground commander with an inborn understanding of topography, the other a river warrior masterful at using enemy waters to his advantage. Grant had planned a major land advance down the railroad from the north, but after talking with Porter, the general decided to send one corps under William T. Sherman down the Mississippi under the protection of the River Squadron to the mouth of the Yazoo River a few miles above Vicksburg. I thought this plan an admirable one, noted Porter. This was the preliminary step to the capture of Vicksburg. Porter led his squadron down the Mississippi to Memphis and found General Sherman embarking troops on a long line of river steamers. Unfortunately, Grant's land advance would be turned back when Confederate cavalry got into his rear and destroyed a primary supply depot on the vulnerable railroad. The rebels, however, could not stop Porter and Sherman on the river. Overseeing 6 gunboats and 59 transports, Porter delivered Sherman's 32,000 troops to the banks of the Yazoo River a few miles north of the city. What followed was the disastrous Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, in which the Bluecoats suffered bloody repulse against formidable defenses in rain-soaked swamps. But as Porter's first major amphibious landing, the operation was wholly successful. Ironclads and gunboats cleared the mines from the river, or torpedoes in Civil War terminology. They covered the landing, they suppressed enemy batteries and troop concentrations, and extracted the Union forces when the odds turned. The ironclad Cairo was sunk by mines, and the other boats took many hits. But a powerful team, for the first time, melded maritime mobility and firepower with hard fighting on land. Sherman and Porter became lifelong friends. Porter then transported Sherman's army back up the Mississippi and 40 miles up the Arkansas River to clear out the rebels at Fort Hinman, Arkansas post. I attacked with ironclads and several smaller vessels, and in 3 hours disabled all the guns, Porter recalled. General Sherman surrounded the place with his troops, and after heavy losses, it surrendered. During that flooded and disease-ridden winter of 1862-63, wrote Porter, General Grant saw that there was no use in sitting down before Vicksburg and simply looking at it. The general and the admiral together conducted a series of intense operations to outflank the city from the north and east by digging canals, blowing up levees, flooding the Mississippi Delta, and pushing ironclads, gunboats, and troop transports through sluggish swamps, timeless forests of gigantic trees, and tiny choked channels. In all of which, wrote Porter, I have to say that we failed most egregiously. The first expedition through Yazoo Pass involved 2 ironclads, 4 clads, and about 4,000 troops and 13 transports. Slowed by natural obstacles, the column was halted in narrow byways and turned back by rapidly constructed rebel gun emplacements. Porter complained about disunity of command after the Army Brigadier General in charge of the troops refused to attack the enemy emplacements as requested by the Lieutenant Commander commanding the boats. There was a kind of standoff between the Army and the Navy and no disposition to act in concert. Because this was a naval expedition, the Admiral thought the General should have followed the instructions of the Lieutenant Commander. Porter noted in his memoirs that General Grant had no control over him whatever, and he was never constrained by Navy Department orders. Left to his own discretion, however, I always deferred to Grant's wishes in all matters. He instructed subordinates to obey orders of Generals Grant and Sherman as if they came from him. Hence, we always acted in the most perfect accord. Probably the first major instance of inter-service joint operations. This was an unusual act of teamwork from a man not known for deference to authority, particularly of another service. The personal and professional connection between the sailor and the soldier were critical, but reporters discussed their subordinates at Yazoo Pass had not been so cooperative. So the Admiral took personal command of the next expedition through Steele's Bayou, pushing 5 ironclads and 4 mortar rafts towed by tugs through dense and deeply inundated forest and along narrow twisting canals flanked by high banks. They rammed over ancient trees and knocked bridges into kindling to the astonishment of the slaves along the banks. But the Confederates began chopping down huge trees both in front and behind the column, while deploying sharpshooters and field pieces and trapping the whole squadron. Porter was trapped and prepared to destroy his boats, but Sherman rushed through his troops to the rescue, cleared the rebels out so that the Navy could back out. Sometimes when we would strike one of these trees, wrote Porter, a multitude of vermin would be shaken out on the deck, among them rats, mice, cockroaches, snakes, and lizards, which would be swept overboard by sailors standing ready with their brooms. Sweepers, sweepers. Old Tecumseh came riding up, recalled the Admiral, and assured him, "My boys will put you through. Your gunboats sure look like they had a terrible hammering." It was with the greatest delight that we got out of that ditch and into the open woods again, with plenty of sea room and no lee shores. But, Porter recalled, Steele's Bayou was one of the most remarkable military and naval expeditions that ever set out in any country. These expeditions are largely forgotten now, but they should be remembered. Having been thwarted at every northern approach, the railroad route, Chickasaw Bayou, Yazoo Pass, and Steele's Bayou, Grant had no alternative but to march his army down through the swamps on the west bank, cross the big muddy below the city, and get at Vicksburg from the south and east. But to do that, Porter's ironclads, gunboats, and transports had to run the gauntlet of the batteries on the bluff. A one-time venture if they could even survive it. It would be suicidal to try to steam back up against the current. Failure would leave the Army stranded on the West Bank and end the campaign. The cooperation of the Navy was absolutely essential to its success, even to the contemplation of such an enterprise, which Grant recalled. I had no more authority to command Porter than he had to command me. But Porter fell into the plan at once and suggested that he had better superintend the preparations, as sailors would probably understand the work better than the soldiers. On April 16, 1863, a clear night with no moon, 7 gunboats and 3 transports got underway with Porter in the lead ironclad. Every fort and hilltop vomited force shot and shell, many of the latter bursting in the air and doing no damage, but adding to the grandeur of the scene. On April 22nd, 6 more boats loaded with supplies made the run. Only 2 transports were lost total, 13 men wounded and none killed. So Grant marched his 32,000 men down the West Bank to the point opposite Grand Gulf. Porter's gunboats and transports assembled there, but the crossing was blocked by a rebel fortress. The Battle of Grand Gulf was fought on April 29, 1863, and won by the Navy. And it was as hard a fight as any that occurred during the war, wrote Porter. For more than 5 hours, the gunboats engaged the enemy batteries at close quarters. The latter, having 13 heavy guns placed on commanding heights from 80 to 100 feet at 20 feet above the river. Porter lost 75 men killed and wounded, but silenced the batteries and allowed the troop transports to pass safely. Grant crossed further south at Bruinsburg and then commenced the legendary campaign that would bring Vicksburg's surrender on July 4, 1862, and Grant's rise to supreme command. In his memoirs, Ulysses S. Grant concluded, "The Navy under Porter was all it could be during the entire campaign. Without its assistance, the campaign could not have been successfully made with twice the number of men engaged. It could not have been made at all in the way it was with any number of men without such assistance. The most perfect harmony reigned between the 2 arms of the service." In Admiral Porter's opinion, the Vicksburg campaign was the most remarkable and most successful military operation of the Civil War, and was the crowning move toward placing the Father of Waters once more under the absolute control of its legitimate rulers. In a conflict that suffered many disastrous clashes of leadership, these 2 superb commanders set the example for joint river operations. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Neil Shettling, an adjunct professor of history at Lone Star College. And he's a graduate of the University of New Orleans, the University of Houston, and the University of Louisiana Monroe. He also spent 9 years in the Navy as a surface warfare officer. Spirit for the Swells, right? He's the author of Defending the Arteries of Rebellion, Confederate Naval Operations in the Mississippi River Valley, and Fought Like the Devils, the Confederate gunboat McCrae. Today he'll tell us about a very interesting interlude in the Panama.
All right, good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so from 1849 to 1860, $403,872,949 in precious metals shipped from San Francisco, California to Panama City. The voyage continued across the isthmus to Cologne, thence to New York. The fighting of the United States Civil War did not slow shipments. Another $197,850,600 in treasure departed San Francisco between 1861 and 1865. These shipments were targeted by Confederate naval forces and countermeasures implemented by the United States most notably the introduction of a sustained convoy system to accompany treasure shipments through dangerous waters. These measures kept the United States financially solvent through its Civil War, built international relationships in Latin America, and helped maintain the Monroe Doctrine at a time when Europeans sought reintervention. Next slide. Gold was carried along the Panama route by the Pacific Mail Steamship Company between San Francisco and Panama City, and Cornelius Vanderbilt's Atlantic and Pacific Mail Company from New York to Cologne, known by U.S. interests at the time as Aspinwall. Both connected across the isthmus via the Panama Railroad. With no major gold deposits and an enslaved labor-based economy, Confederate financial stability became a primary concern. Hard currency was needed to establish international credit and finance war efforts. Its initial treasury amounted to only $481,353 in gold coins. And with early cost projections of $375 million, the Confederacy realized, quote, gold and silver have become articles of commerce like iron and lead. Next slide, please. Fully half of the U.S. Treasury consisted of annual California gold shipments. Maintaining this flow was crucial for a stable wartime economy, quote, the lifeblood of U.S. credit. The loss of the Panama route steamer Central America's $1.6 million in gold sparked the Panic of 1857. Maintaining the Panama route's flow allowed for a comparative economic advantage via financial stability and limited wartime inflation. Keeping Confederate bullion supply low also allowed the United States to pressure their economy elsewhere. With no stockpiled mineral wealth, cotton and a growing system of slavery remained the linchpins of Confederate economic activity. Ensuring this remained so by keeping control over gold mines and shipping lanes helped allow President Lincoln to target slavery as a war measure. Next slide, please. Vessel owners recognized they were a target, petitioning Lincoln's cabinet, demanding protection as, quote, the capture of even one of these steamers would stop shipments of gold. Pacific Mail Steamship Company President Allen McLean wrote his Atlantic counterpart Cornelius Vanderbilt, believing the Navy, quote, should give us protection. Too preoccupied recalling its overseas fleet and forging a blockade, the U.S. Navy lacked warships to help, instead providing surplus arms to protect the Panama route steamers. The Navy Department did dispatch warships to strategic locations. In the Pacific, vessels patrolled Panama City's harbor and the heavily trafficked Mexican coastline. In the Caribbean, sailing vessels Falmouth and Bainbridge went to Cologne to protect, quote, the California steamships with their passengers and treasure. Confederate President Jefferson Davis recognized, quote, the importance of shutting off great gold shipments to the east from California. Southerners start letters of marque and reprisal, sparking talks of privateers targeting Vanderbilt steamers. The Confederacy's first commerce raider, CSS Sumter, escaped to open sea. Commander Raphael Semmes possessed a desire to intercept, quote, homeward bound California and Brazilian vessels. Future Admiral David B. Porter told Washington as much, writing that Semmes will, quote, soon be in Aspinwall, and where will your California gold be then? Blockaders hunted Sumter without effect. Military officers returning east from California as passengers organized makeshift defenses should Sumter appear. Semmes, recognizing the Caribbean was becoming hazardous, crossed the Atlantic to Gibraltar. A direct threat against Western mineral wealth came in 1862 when Confederate Brigadier General Henry Sibley led a small army to seize the U.S. Southwest. He battled small garrisons and isolated fortifications across New Mexico territory, organized Confederate Arizona Territory, seized Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and secured local mines. United States volunteers from California and Colorado Territory outmaneuvered Sibley, driving him back to Texas, ending major Confederate efforts to interdict Western bullion mines. At sea, Confederate commerce raiders dispatched from Europe gained traction. Flag Officer Samuel Barron, commanding Confederate naval forces in Europe, received guidance to prioritize targeting the Panama route. Barron issued orders to all European-built warships, including the commerce raiders Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Rappahannock, and Shenandoah, as well as the ironclad Stonewall, to capture, quote, the enemy's treasure and passenger ships. In September 1862, Gideon Welles countered by establishing the U.S. Navy's West India Squadron, providing clear guidance, quote, it is presumed that the rebel privateers will endeavor to capture the treasure ships from Aspinwall, and your particular attention is directed to their protection. Acting Rear Admiral Charles Wilkes, famous for commanding U.S. Antarctic exploration and precipitating 1861's Trent affair, commanded the squadron at President Lincoln's insistence. Next slide, please. The Confederacy's naval assaults against the vessels carrying bullion were most successful between December 1862 and June 1863, where in quick but uncoordinated succession, raiders captured a Vanderbilt steamer, captured a ship packed with silver, and threatened California waters. In December 1862, now Captain Raphael Semmes, commanding the raider Alabama, entered the Windward Passage between Haiti and Cuba, quote, waiting for our California friends. He intercepted and captured the Vanderbilt steamer Ariel on December 7, 1862, though it was on its way to Cologne to pick up gold shipments. Semmes ultimately bonded Ariel for $261,000. 2 months later, the small sailing privateer Retribution captured 2 merchants near the Crooked Island Passage, directly along the route of Vanderbilt steamers, compounding apprehensions regarding the safety of the Panama route. More Confederates received sanction from Jefferson Davis to outfit a San Francisco privateer. They quietly purchased and converted the sailing vessel J.M. Chapman, outlining plans to cripple the, quote, outward flow of gold on which the Union cause depended in large measure. Last-minute intelligence sealed the privateer's fate. The morning Chapman was to depart San Francisco. Police, revenue officers, harbor masters, and sailors from USS Cyan seized the ship in March 1863. Another strike by CSS Florida captured a load of silver. Its commander, John Maffitt, was eager to capture treasure, quote, pretty quick when we get them. Admiral Wilkes believed the same about, quote, Florida's intention to await the California steamers. On June 16, 1863, Florida captured Benjamin F. Hoxie, journeying around Cape Horn from California to England, packed with $105,000 in silver ore and bars from Mazatlan, Mexico. Benjamin F. Hoxie was Connecticut-owned, and Maffitt dismissed the master's, quote, very irregular explanation of neutral cargo, seizing the silver as a legitimate capture. He burned the vessel and steered for Bermuda, where in mid-July, it was transferred to a Confederate shipping agent and sent to England. From there, the silver went to France for smelting, but British, US, and French lawyers and diplomats intervened, with courts eventually ruling in favor of Hoxie. Next slide, please. These Confederate strikes convinced the United States to take more measured protection of the Panama route. Those ships without weapons or military detachments were armed. New inspection protocols were implemented for cargo and passengers, with weapons confiscated for a voyage's duration, and new passes required for all ships in New York and San Francisco harbors. Additionally, Vanderbilt began diverting treasure shipped out of Cologne to a secondary route via neutral Britain, before being transshipped to New York as neutral cargo. From January 1863 to November 1864, more gold was sent via transshipment through England instead of directly to New York. The Navy now began direct protection of treasure ships. Once Washington learned of Ariel's capture, Navy Secretary Gideon Welles ordered an emergency convoy from Cologne by USS Connecticut. In January 1863, it completed the first official naval convoy of the Vanderbilt steamer Champion and the Nicaraguan route steamer America, collectively transporting $1,357,840 in gold. Connecticut continued until mid-May 1863, convoying 13 Panama route passengers without incident. The journey was altered, however, to deceive Confederate raiders. The Vanderbilt steamers continued their traditional route to Cologne through the Windward Passage, where Wilkes sent USS Santiago de Cuba to ensure safe passage. Once in Cologne, USS Connecticut provided escort to the now treasure-laden ships through the Yucatan Straits. Once into the Gulf of Mexico, believing the blockade provided ample protection, the convoy was abandoned and Connecticut returned to Cologne. Next slide, please. Connecticut's continuous operations took their toll, and replacement warships Mercedita and Rhode Island were dispatched. The convoys then shifted exclusively through the Windward Passage, with escorts meeting Vanderbilt steamers at Mayaguana Island before convoying them through the Windward Passage to the U.S.-claimed Guano Island of Naval. Steamers loaded with gold shifted to making the return voyage through this route in reverse. To forward deploy supplies, Wilkes worked with local leadership, docking the supply vessel National Guard as a forward staging base at Cap Haitien on the northern Haiti coastline. Consular agents cooperated with naval officers, forwarding information about Confederate intentions and photographs of Confederate raiders. Wilkes also made enemies. Complaints from British, Danish, Dutch, Mexican, and Spanish officials forced Gideon Welles to relieve the admiral. Replacing Wilkes was acting Rear Admiral James Lardner, who assumed command of the West India Squadron in June 1863, just as Florida captured Benjamin F. Hoxie. Under Lardner, from May 1863 to August 1864, 6 warships, Mercedita, Rhode Island, Juniata, Santiago de Cuba, Neptune, and Galatea, completed 43 convoys without incident. He sent monthly reports to keep the Navy Department informed. Passengers appreciated the escorts, with one writing, quote, "We took our convoy and were much relieved from the feeling of solitude on the wide waters." Despite these safeguards, threats emerged in 1864 of passengers seizing a ship. This became apparent when in May 1864, a draft of sailors on the Vanderbilt steamer Ocean Queen mutinied. Several sailors taking passage to the Pacific Squadron were shot for refusing to follow orders. Naval officers pondered the feasibility of Confederate agents seizing a treasure ship from within. Many Ocean Queen passengers believed this is what nearly occurred. Both naval and military intelligence reports hinted at this, and in truth, Confederate naval agents were working throughout 1864 to seize a treasure ship from within. A force of Confederate sailors escaped the blockade, traveling in small teams to the Panama Isthmus. In November 1864, they boarded the mail steamer Salvador, intending to seize it disguised as passengers. United States naval officers and diplomats tracked them, and when they boarded Salvador, were quickly captured. It was a testament to the cooperative efforts of naval commanders, sailors, diplomats, and business tycoons to protect and stabilize the United States economy. Next slide, please. By summer 1864, questions arose over the sustainment and supply as overworked escorts went to New York for overhaul. The Cap-Haitien-based supply ship National Guard refilled its coal at Key West, but when returning to Haiti in July 1864, fever struck the crew and its supplies were offloaded to a local warehouse as the vessel proceeded north for medical treatment. A budding Haitian partnership was bearing fruit, and despite worn-down vessels, convoys continued through August 1864, when circumstances changed operations. New Confederate raiders, including Tallahassee and Chickamauga, prowled the Atlantic seaboard, combined with threats of established raiders such as Florida, then on its second cruise. The Navy Department expanded treasure convoys to the entire Atlantic portion of the Panama route. Cornelius Vanderbilt was happy to accept, believing full convoys would boost, quote, confidence of the traveling public as well as the shippers of treasure. This new system changed Navy Department leadership thinking, with Confederate raiding activities shifting from the Caribbean to the Atlantic seaboard. Welles recalled Lardner, dissolving the West India Squadron. Convoys would now operate as a special detail managed by Rear Admiral Hiram Paulding in New York. Full convoy escorts were often not up to the task. The first, from September 3rd through 26, 1864, highlighted this. USS Nereus, assigned as escort, also carried word to Admiral Lardner of the policy change. Confusion resulted when Lardner's flagship, believed to be escort Nereus, was a prowling Confederate. The two warships collided, and Nereus continued its convoy limping into Cologne for emergency repairs. It accompanied North Star, packed with $465,000 in treasure on its return voyage, but was, quote, unable to keep up in a storm off Virginia's coast. The gold-laden North Star traversed Tallahassee's and Chickamauga's hunting grounds alone. Similar occurrences continued with other full route convoys. Next slide, please. By the end of the year, as Confederate raiding activity waned, the full convoy system was abandoned. 7 full route convoys were assigned between August and November 1864, and though successfully guarding all gold shipments, they fell short of expectations. 5 escorts encountered engineering problems and forced delays or the temporary abandonment of a convoy. The other 2 had treasure ships abandon their escorts, preferring speed to protection. The Navy reverted to partial convoys through the Windward Passage once again, and the Cap-Haitien supply station was restocked. Commander John P. Sanford of USS Neptune assumed charge of the reconstituted 6-ship West India convoy fleet. A final threat to the Vanderbilt line of treasure ships came at the conflict's end when the French-built Confederate ironclad Stonewall crossed the Atlantic with orders advising, quote, the interception of the California steamers. Sanford kept a sharp lookout should the Confederate ironclad approach the Windward Passage, but Stonewall was ultimately bottled in Havana. With Stonewall surrendered and the Confederate government collapsed, the West India convoy fleet was disbanded in June 1865. Next slide, please. 151 separate trips were completed by Cornelius Vanderbilt's Atlantic and Pacific Mail Company between April 1861 and June 1865, transporting $82,845,979 in gold from Cologne to New York directly. 57% of the voyages, and all after December 1862, were completed with some form of protective escort. These convoys stabilized the U.S. economy and controlled wartime inflation, despite a growing national debt, eventually growing to $2.8 billion during the war, while denying the Confederacy the precious metals to stabilize their own economy. The establishment of Cap Haitien as a forward operating base was critical, hinting at Alfred Thayer Mahan's future doctrine of, quote, stations along the road, established, quote, not primarily for trade, but for defense and war. National Guard's anchorage in Haitian waters ensured safe harbor to U.S. merchants, while providing a forward deployed base to maintain United States Caribbean interests, simultaneously achieving Mahan's views of overseas naval bases with modern concepts like expeditionary mobile bases now deployed by the United States Navy. Next slide, please. These convoys also allowed President Lincoln to maintain an international presence in Latin America at a time when the Monroe Doctrine, advocating United States hegemony and European departure across the Americas, was being challenged. French intervention in Mexico, war between Spain and South American nations, attempted Spanish conquest of Santo Domingo, and increased pushes by the British to dominate Caribbean trade all occurred while the United States staved off secessionism. Actions by the Pacific Squadron to guard key harbors, combined with the West India Squadron and West India Convoy Fleet, ensured the United States retained a Latin American presence and fostered a renewed emphasis on the Monroe Doctrine after the Confederacy's collapse. Issues raised by these convoys reemerged 50 years later during both world wars, when convoys became a major U.S. naval priority. Only then did the U.S. Navy successfully supply forward bases and implement sustained escort rotation. By no means would an avid study of the Panama route convoys have forged an easier battle of the Atlantic, but it might have helped foster earlier thinking about expected obstacles and priorities. Ultimately, the U.S. Navy's Panama route convoys provided cost-effective protection of mineral wealth vital to ensuring a stable economy as the country was ripped apart. With California gold securely flowing east, the United States paid its war debts easier, stabilized inflation, and deprived the Confederacy of critical funds needed to establish a fledgling country. Compounding this was the benefit of showing the flag and maintaining open sea lanes through the Caribbean, all while hinting that the Monroe Doctrine was not disappearing even amid civil war, and that U.S. hegemony over Latin America remained a priority. The U.S. Navy's Panama route convoys were never at the top of the priority list, but the short and long-term benefits were well worth dispatching the dozen ships that ultimately served as escorts to Cornelius Vanderbilt's Atlantic and Pacific Mail Company's treasure ships. Thank you.
Our last presenter is Diana Uyghur.
No, you got it.
Okay.
We good.
The credit has been butchered my entire life. That's why I try to get people's last names correct. She's a PhD student in political science at the University of Chicago and a faculty associate for research in the Department of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. Her dissertation examines the politics of secrecy and international security cooperation, focusing on the development and sale of advanced conventional weapons. Her other research includes nuclear and conventional deterrence, maritime strategy, and South Asian security stability issues.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for welcoming me here, despite my political scientist background. It is a delight to be here. I apologize in advance if I talk about variables. And as Professor DeCredico, okay, I feel I should return the favor, mentioned, my dissertation looks at sort of secrecy as a state behavior in sort of security cooperation, and particularly the case that I'm going to discuss today is I find interesting, and I'm kind of curious if this sort of will sound reasonable to all of you, but I welcome at the end questions or even comments about sort of what am I missing, or is this sort of, am I going in the good direction? All right, so this paper is titled "No Attempts to Disguise What Is Now Apparent to All: Secretly Arming the Confederate Navy in Britain." I had to drop the French case for time and space reasons. So from the earliest days of the American Civil War, the Confederacy sought to acquire warships from Great Britain and France. The South lacked an indigenous shipbuilding industry, being an agrarian society, and then developing that sort of necessary infrastructure and getting skilled labor was going to be very time consuming, which they did not have. Ships obtained abroad, obviously, could sort of provide a stopgap that would allow the Confederate Navy to threaten Union merchants, to blockade, things like that. So without these ships, obviously, the Union Navy could prevent necessary supplies from reaching the South, and equally important, prevent cotton from reaching Europe, and thus constraining the South's ability to obtain loans or to pay for war material. Appreciated all of the sort of things you said, because it sort of has a lot of background for mine, so thank you. So though both European powers were heavily reliant on Southern cotton, their native impulse to support the Confederacy was nevertheless subsumed to an official policy of neutrality, at least publicly. In private, however, both countries would go on to allow warships to be purchased by Confederate agents. Under the legal fig leaf that they carried no guns and therefore could not be called warships, the British government knowingly violated domestic law by permitting 2 ships to be sold in 1861, and then additional ships later. The French patterned their deception after the British a year later. So the question I'm looking at is sort of what motivated these 2 powerful states with legitimate economic and strategic interests in supporting the South to maintain this implausible fiction that they were truly neutral bystanders. So in this paper, I explore the politics and practices of official secrecy in British material support to the Confederate Navy during the American Civil War, seeking to understand what enabled Britain to provide support initially, why it felt compelled to stop, and why it was unwilling to provide that support publicly. This is not intended to stand alone, as I mentioned. It's part of a dissertation project on the logic of secrecy and security cooperation, particularly around politically sensitive, high-end military technologies, primarily conventional. I'm focusing on the effort to arm the Confederate Navy for several reasons. First, all parties knew that the sale of warships to the Confederacy would be a non-trivial contribution to the war effort. At the outset of the Civil War, the Confederate Navy was almost non-existent. The Union's blockade, though initially questionable, had clear potential to become a real menace to the Confederacy's ability to sustain itself. Second, the degree to which this activity was an open secret, particularly in Britain, raises questions sort of about why the actors involved embraced this implausible deniability in the first place. And finally, this opportunity to compare and contrast the British and French cases will eventually allow for sort of a richer analysis of what enables or constrains states that might be wanting to support a potential protege. That's the political science part of this paper. So this paper will argue that Britain maintained a public position of strict neutrality, primarily in order to complicate the Union's ability to choose a sufficiently costly response, right? One that would compel Britain to meaningfully enforce its domestic laws constraining private companies in their dealings with the Confederates. I'll talk briefly by sort of explaining this idea of secrecy in arms sales and kind of why I think this is interesting and why states may be willing to incur the costs and risks associated with doing things secretly. And then I'll talk more about sort of Britain's neutrality, where that came from, and then the legal and political benefits of the Confederacy of this process. So why secrecy in arms sales at all? It sort of seems common sense, like of course they would keep things secret, but it should be a little bit surprising. We might expect states would really prefer to engage publicly because there are a lot of costs and operational risks associated with keeping things secret. The impetus for secrecy around military capabilities is often thought to be operational, right? You may have to hide your military assets from an adversary to allow for strategic surprise. Some capabilities are only valuable if they remain concealed, though that tends to be a more modern problem. Other scholars have argued that secrecy shields leaders in domestic political environments in which open cooperation sort of generate hostility and blowback in a domestic political space. What I'm looking at, and empirically, we often see states using secrecy when the target of their assistance is of lesser importance than some other national objective. which suggests, I think, a third logic of secrecy, sort of forestalling punishment from a third party. And aside from providing for their own self-defense, obviously, states' most pressing priority is often economic, protecting access to trade and financial markets, retaining their position as a rule maker within international institutions, things like that. And so while states may find it worthwhile to increase a protege's military strength to achieve, in this case, Confederate victory and break up the Union, they have to consider the potential costs that they're likely to incur from these third-party states that might disapprove of the relationship, in this case, the United States, and others potentially. So in seeking to balance this cost-benefit calculus, states must also consider what options are available for staving off those costs or mitigating them. And so making it difficult for a third party to prove the full extent of the relationship can complicate their ability to calibrate their response and justify that response, thus allowing the relationship to persist even when operational surprise is gone and domestic politics is not the issue. So, British neutrality, the political basis therefore. So in the run-up to the attack on Fort Sumter, Britain had watched with disdain as the United States came apart, but the government had declined to take sides in the matter. While many in Britain were broadly sympathetic to the South, the upheaval was seen primarily as a domestic problem for the Union, and many were sort of just hoping it would deter the democracy-minded in Britain. Following the attack, however, President Lincoln's declaration of an intention to impose a blockade against the South was misread in Britain as a declaration of blockade. Under international law, the establishment of a blockade elevated the conflict to a war and granted both antagonists the status of legal belligerents. In this context, Britain was obligated to stake a clear position. On May 13th, the day Charles Francis Adams, the new U.S. minister to the United Kingdom, arrived in London, Queen Victoria issued a proclamation of neutrality that acknowledged the Union and Confederacy as belligerents and claimed neutral rights for Britain. British neutrality rested on the legal foundations of the 1856 Treaty of Paris, which legitimized belligerents' military forces, allowed their navies to enter British ports for critical maintenance needs, utilize prize ports, and legally confiscate enemy goods intended for use in war. It also engaged on domestic laws, specifically the Foreign Enlistment Act of 1819, which prohibited conduct by British citizens that would risk drawing Britain into a foreign war. Foreign powers were not permitted to recruit military forces within Britain, and the law threatened to strip all protections from any British national who joined a foreign belligerent's military. So while Britain may have viewed this as a sort of truly neutral approach, to the Union this was a gross betrayal. The Lincoln administration had been threatening war. Britain recognized the Confederacy as a sovereign state, but the formal designation of belligerency was almost as bad. While the Proclamation of Neutrality did not recognize Confederate independence and thus condoned full participation in international life, it gave the Confederates hope and conferred a sense of legitimacy on their claim of statehood, and raised them sort of to a status nearly on par with that of the Union. Secretary of State Seward was particularly pugnacious, and even as British Foreign Minister Lord Russell is trying to explain this proclamation as merely a way to, quote, explain to British subjects their liabilities in case they should engage in the war. So, in this context, James Bullock, the Confederate Navy's chief purchasing agent in Europe, had already left the Confederate capital of Montgomery, Alabama, when neutrality was announced. He arrived in Britain on June 4th, 1861, made contact with Charles Priolo, I can't pronounce that, at Fraser Trenholm and Company, a South Carolina-based cotton brokerage, which had been serving as the South's bank in England. Having established the firm's willingness to extend credit to Bullock, with Priolo taking personal responsibility for any orders made before the funds arrived, Bullock hired a lawyer, Frederick S. Hull, to determine the legal ramifications of his purchasing objectives. If I do this, what's going to happen here? Hull determined that one clause of the Foreign Enlistment Act was particularly relevant and particularly vague. Section 7 made it illegal for a British national to sell, quote, any ship or vessel that was intended for war against any country with which Britain was at peace. Okay, sure. Since its passage, however, there have been no legal challenges that would set a precedent and authoritatively determine what constituted a violation of Section 7 of this act. So in this act of sort of, legal ledger demand, Hull argued that only a ship equipped with guns could be considered a warship. But not just equipped, like it had to be literally on the ship for this to be considered a warship. And he obtained concurrence from other lawyers that this was an appropriate definition of the term. And while this was patently absurd from a navalist point of view, that warships were obviously designed and constructed on different principles than almost any other type of ship, Hull was able to shift the illegality onto the equipping of warships rather than the building of them and the sale of them. They weren't illegal until the guns were on board, and before that, everything was fine. So as long as British shipyards did not install the guns on British territory, the sale would be considered legal under Hull's interpretation. He disseminated this opinion widely and fairly quickly became accepted as this, kind of clever way to provide support to the Confederacy without running afoul of the Foreign Enlistment Act. So with this legal gray zone established, Bullock proceeded to purchase and equip his warships, though he remained conscious of the risks of doing so openly. So using a variety of methods that range from kind of the whimsical, naming his first ship Oretto to sell the lie that it was being built for the Italian government, to the very mundane, quotidian, like ensuring legal owners of his ships did not bear very obvious connections to the Confederate government. Bullock was able to contract for a number of custom-designed warships from British shipyards, including the Oretto, which was later CSS Florida, the 290, which was later CSS Alabama, and then the Laird Rams. So throughout this period, Union diplomats sort of, watching these things being built and kind of freaking out reasonably. And they're trying to induce the British government to prevent these ships from departing Britain, trying to argue that these are in fact warships, you're violating your own laws. But their pleas fell on deaf ears and sluggish bureaucrats. Union agents were crawling Liverpool and London trying to obtain the necessary proof to substantiate the Union's case. The Confederacy was violating the laws of neutrality. But it was always too little too late. And with the exception of the Laird Rams, the decision to prevent the release of the ships only seemed to arrive after the ships had sailed from London. So my argument is that Britain's gambit worked, right? The United States was hard-pressed to marshal sufficient evidence in time to prevent the ships from sailing, and after they had departed, was unable to formulate any sort of response that would make the British government take its concerns more seriously the next time. Lord Russell's hesitancy regarding the detention of Oretto and especially the Alabama, the 290, along with his insistence that the Union produce incontrovertible legal evidence before he would even begin to consider acting, makes it clear that Britain was not indifferent, it was not neutral to the outcomes of the conflict, and was willing to provide real material aid to one side, as long as it would not result in a declaration of war by the United States. So I think the counterfactual is instructive here. It's unclear what repercussions Britain would have faced had Russell detained these ships on hearsay and on sort of this, we all know what's going on, right? On the very reasonable grounds that a ship missing its guns and gun carriages could nevertheless still be identified as a warship, and would thus be in violation of the Foreign Enlistment Act and the rights and responsibilities of neutrals. The Confederates would have had very few levers to pull if their ships had been detained. The Union blockade had ensured that cotton shipments from the South were already scarce. So withholding cotton when there's very little cotton coming through would not really have been a meaningful threat, particularly when the South was so desperate for funds. Furthermore, President Jefferson Davis's short-sighted decision to withhold cotton and create artificial scarcity before the war, and there was no cotton warehoused overseas that they could potentially refuse to sell. And returning to the logic expressed earlier, if the Confederacy's activities were fully within the law, why would they have chosen to incur the expense of hiding it? And why would Britain have felt it would be risking war with the United States if it allowed the sale to go through? Clearly, everybody knows they're doing something a little dodgy here, right? So if Russell's priority was making sure the domestic industry wasn't left in the lurch, the Royal Navy could have potentially bought the ships, as they would do with the Laird Rams. So in the face of this sort of alternative pathway, it becomes puzzling why Britain would risk war, a war that it had gone to great pains to avoid on other occasions, such as during the Trent affair, over this implausible fiction that warships were not in fact warships. And the most reasonable explanation that I can see is that Britain was truly seeking to bolster the Confederacy's military capabilities. So why wouldn't it do it publicly? It was afraid of going to war with the United States. But to say that Britain feared war with the United States is, I think, a little simplistic, and kind of conjures this notion of a state fearing, defeat and subjugation to an adversary. As a leading world power, as I'm sort of doing all this research, I kept being like, well, why does Britain care? What, I'm not going to lose. How could it have expected to lose a war with a state that is struggling to subdue a rebellion on its own territory? This seems questionable. What's happening here? Right? So rather, it's that Britain fears fighting this war with the United States. Fighting this war would require significant resources. It would create domestic, political, and economic problems that would cause long-term harm to the government, and it would give France an opportunity to gain a greater toehold in Mexico. Following the Crimean War, it ended in 1856. A few years earlier, Britain had demobilized a significant portion of the Royal Navy, and a war with the United States would require remobilization at a time when the Royal Navy was sort of trying to incorporate advances in naval technology and trying to, it's a very expensive proposition, right? You don't necessarily want to be like, okay, we'll also do a war at the same time. Protecting merchant shipping from Union predation would add further complexity to that process. And furthermore, while the South was, the preferred supplier of cotton to British textile mills, it was nevertheless possible to find alternative sources of cotton, such as India. Quality might not be as good, but it wasn't, it wasn't going to totally ruin the entire economy. But the North, however, was a significant consumer of finished products, and replacing that customer base quickly would have been very difficult, if not impossible. Most importantly, war with the United States would limit Britain's ability to counter France in the near term, and to preserve the legal order that would confer significant benefits to Britain in the event of a war with France in the longer term. So while Britain and France broadly shared a goal of ending the American Civil War as quickly as possible, preferably with the Confederacy having won, the close relationship that they had enjoyed in the Crimean War had already begun to fray by 1861. Britain did not trust Emperor Napoleon III's ambitions. They feared he was seeking to supplant Britain as the leading European and thus global power. And so the centrality of France in this sort of British decision-making process could be seen in Britain's response to the Union blockade. Right? The Treaty of Paris required that a blockade must be effective to be legal, which is a pretty tall order given the length of southern coastline to be controlled, the relatively meager size of the United States Navy at the outset of the war. And so while Britain could have easily challenged this blockade on legal grounds in order to continue its trade with the South, it chose instead to respect the Union's blockade, primarily to avoid setting a precedent that could then be used against them in the future in a war with France. So, to conclude, to side with its preferred belligerent, to side with the Confederacy publicly, would carry a lot of second and third order effects that would challenge Britain's ability to maintain the international legal order it had helped create in 1856. And so while Britain may have preferred a ruptured union with all the strategic and economic possibilities that might offer, pursuing that goal openly would have risked more critical and more proximate national objectives. And so to accomplish two of those objectives, protecting the international legal order that it benefited from, and to avoid the expense and sort of political turbulence of warfare, even though they're not expected to lose, Britain still had to avoid provoking the United States into open warfare, which would have resulted in so by maintaining this facade that it was not knowingly providing military support to the Confederacy or allowing its citizens to provide that support, Britain made it very difficult for the United States to either take the decision to go to war unilaterally or to recruit other nations to censure Britain for its behavior. So even though everybody knew what was happening and what was going on, and it was obvious to all, there was still a strategic and political reason to maintain this fiction that Britain was in fact a true neutral. So I will stop there, and I welcome any questions and comments.
I'd love to do pieces when I get finished.
Commentators at conferences such as this have an unfortunate habit of asking panelists to write papers and present them that they, the commentators, wanted to have written. I hope I have not fallen into this trap. These three papers complement each other quite well. Dwight Hughes addresses the importance of command relationships as the Union embarked upon and embraced riverine warfare in the Western theater of the Civil War. Neil Shettling examines a little-known element of the Union blockade, when the U.S. Navy tried to protect merchant ships that carried much-needed harsh specie from California to the East Coast to fund the Union war effort. Finally, Diana Uyghur looks at the surreptitious British efforts to assist the Confederacy in building warships, especially commerce raiders and blockade runners, to challenge the Union Navy's cordon around the 3,500 miles of southern coastline. New Shettling tells of the Confederacy's boldest plan in countering the Union blockade by sending its best commerce raiders to intercept the Pacific Mail Steamship Company and the Atlantic and Pacific Mail Steamship Company shipments of gold bullion from San Francisco to the Isthmus of Panama, thence to the Panama Railroad and on to New York. As Neil demonstrates, the Confederacy was able to seize one steamship loaded with gold in 1862 and another vessel carrying silver in 1863. Obviously, the owners of these steamships, Allen McLean and Cornelius Vanderbilt, were none too pleased to have their lines in the crosshairs of these naval predators. Petitions to Navy Secretary Gideon Welles fell on deaf ears, as the Department of the Navy was initially more concerned with recalling its Pacific Fleet to enforce the blockade and embarking upon an ambitious shipbuilding program to make the blockade legitimate and not the paper one Confederate President Jefferson Davis alleged. That reality was reinforced, as Diane pointed out, by the 1856 Treaty of Paris regarding legal blockades. Confederate successes finally induced the U.S. Navy to provide convoy support for these important shipments of gold. Beginning with arming passenger vessels and ultimately turning to Union warships, the U.S. Navy succeeded in stymieing Confederate efforts to seize gold to support their war effort. It also allowed the U.S. to prove to Europe that even with the Civil War raging, the U.S. would uphold the Monroe Doctrine, notwithstanding Emperor Maximilian's foothold in Mexico. Finally, it demonstrated the success of private-public ventures in supporting the Union. I must note that it was a venture which allowed Cornelius Vanderbilt to amass an even larger fortune. Vanderbilt donated $1 million of those riches to establish a university in Nashville, Tennessee. In gratitude, it was named Vanderbilt University, in recognition of Vanderbilt's philanthropy. It is worth noting that it was the only charitable donation the Commodore ever made in his lifetime. While I was a graduate student at Vanderbilt pursuing my doctoral degree, my law school friends thought Plunderbilt was a more apt name for the university. As with all good papers, this one raises some questions. The dollar figures Neil cites. I wonder if those amounts were in $1860. I also questioned what impact the discovery of silver in Nevada in 1857 had on the financing of the Union war effort. Did the reality that the commerce raiders were built by supposedly neutral Britain play a role in American diplomacy and Lincoln? Did Ambassador Charles Francis Adams engage Lord Palmerston about the damages the two successful Confederate siegers created? Did those losses factor into the Alabama claims case? I hope that this paper is part of a larger work that will address these questions and the impact this gold had on keeping the Union solvent and able to pay for the material of war it needed to defeat the Confederate States. Diana Uyghur's book is but a small portion of her dissertation in progress at the University of Chicago. But her analysis of the British secretly building Confederate commerce raiders to ostensibly break the Union blockade proves once again that war is good business. Britain had declared neutrality, which meant it could trade with both the Union and the Confederacy. As Diana points out, the Foreign Enlistment Act explicitly forbade a British citizen or firm from building warships for countries not at war with Britain. Fortunately for Confederate agents, a British attorney found a convenient loophole that allowed British firms to build commerce raiders for the Confederacy. Those vessels, the most famous being the CSS Alabama, the CSS Florida, and the CSS Shenandoah, effectively destroyed the U.S. merchant fleet and inflicted serious damage on northern shipping. This was classic guerre de course, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis encouraged it by liberally issuing letters of marque and reprisal. Britain would pay for its clandestine shipbuilding efforts. An arbitration tribunal in Geneva in 1872 fined Great Britain $15.5 million for direct losses the commerce raiders inflicted on U.S. shipping during the Civil War. I am hopeful that in the longer dissertation, Diana utilizes the vast correspondence and official reports in the official records of the Union and Confederate navies. I would also suggest, if you haven't consulted it already, Amanda Foreman's award-winning A World on Fire, Britain's Crucial Role in the American Civil War. I'll be very interested to read about France's role in building ships for the Confederacy. Dwight Hughes's The Soldier and the Sailor at Vicksburg, Grant Porter, is an analysis of what he deems was an unappreciated partnership, the collaboration of Major General Ulysses S. Grant and Admiral David Dixon Porter. As he effectively highlights, there was really no precedent for joint operations, especially in the Civil War's Western theater. Union Navy Commodore Silas Stringham and General Benjamin Butler succeeded in seizing Hatteras Inlet in August of 1861. A similar joint expedition led by Flag Officer Samuel DuPont and Brigadier General Thomas Sherman captured Port Royal, South Carolina in November of 1861. Finally, Brigadier General Ambrose Burnside and a naval flotilla took possession of Roanoke Island in February of 1862. But along the Atlantic seacoast, the topography favored joint operations. In the west, the terrain was swampy and the rivers ran north and south, initially allowing riverine operations between the Army of the Tennessee and the gunboats of Flag Officer Andrew Foote to capture Forts Henry and Donaldson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. But the Confederate Gibraltar at Vicksburg was a different story. Located on a high bluff above the Mississippi River and strongly defended by artillery, Vicksburg seemed impregnable. Nonetheless, Grant and Porter would find a way, after much trial and error, to capture this key to the Mississippi. Efforts to build canals through the swamps and to actually try to reroute the Mississippi all came to naught. Then there was the disastrous assault at Chickasaw Bayou. Grant remained undaunted and, working with Porter, determined to have Porter's fleet run the batteries positioned on Vicksburg and to march his army overland to meet Porter. He would then have him ferry the army to the opposite side of the Mississippi at Bruinsburg. That was accomplished by the end of April 1863. After a series of engagements, Grant settled down to siege. Promised relief for the beleaguered Confederate army at Vicksburg never came. As one Confederate soldier told commanding Confederate General John Pemberton, either feed us or surrender. He chose the latter, hoping that surrendering on July 4th, 1863 would allow for better terms. It didn't. True to form, Grant demanded an unconditional surrender. Dwight correctly notes that when dealing with Admiral Porter's memoirs, you have to exercise caution because he was apt to exaggerate and conflate events. Fortunately, Grant's memoirs are one of the classics, clear and dispassionate, with a keen soldier's eye to detail. Coupled with his effective use of the official records of Union and Confederate navies, Dwight captures the remarkable collaboration between the sailor and the soldier. Each of these fine papers demonstrates that the naval war during the American Civil War is getting its due. Each of our presenters has tapped unusual and highly important primary documents in crafting their stories. I envision significant monographs and some follow-up papers at the 2023 McMullen Naval History Symposium coming from this research in progress. Now I would like to open the session up to questions from the audience. I would ask that you identify yourself and your affiliation and direct your questions directly to our speakers. The first question is always the hardest. Yes, sir.
Eddie Valentine, National Museum of the U.S. Navy in D.C. My question is for Diana. Wanted to ask, how do you think the politics of slavery figured into some of Britain's policy decisions and how they thought about their place in the international order? You know, they're one of the leaders in abolition. Just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and sort of is obviously shot through this entire story is sort of, you know, how does Britain justify to itself this support for or its preference for Confederacy when there is this sort of larger kind of moral and yeah, moral and idealistic sort of angle to it, and in part Britain was actually very confused, it seems, by Lincoln's and the Lincoln administration's kind kind of portrayal of this as the goal they're going for is to keep the Union whole. And they did not really engage with the slavery arguments. The Union didn't. They didn't put that forward as the reason initially why this war is happening. That was sort of kept kind of like, we're not going to talk too much about it, in part because the Union needed to kind of keep its coalition of it wasn't going to keep everybody, like saying this is about abolition wasn't going to get everybody on the same side, right? And so Britain kind of was able to use that as a way of being like, well, if it's not about slavery and it's just about keeping the Union together, we don't fully understand why that's important to you, but if that's what you want to argue, then okay, then we're going to go with we don't care if the Union stays together. Obviously, they said this in much more, flowery language, but fundamentally, it seems like they were able to sort of disregard that in favor of what they got from the South, which was, cheaper cotton, better cotton, low tariffs on things because the South desperately needed to sell things, and so the economic angle sort of there was an incentive, there was a pull to okay, with the South is sort of our direction we want to go, and the North didn't sort of give them much to work with on that other side. They were able to kind of I'll stop there. Yeah.
Can I add something to that? My reading has indicated that the Brits were highly conflicted, and there were strong political and economic forces pulling in both directions, and it was a very difficult situation for them to resolve. But in my mind, there were three general reasons. Number one is, as she said, the war didn't seem to be about slavery for the first 2 years of it, and it seemed to be hypocritical. Union shippers were complicit in the illegal slave trade. There were still slave states in the Union, the border states, and so they didn't. The Brits hated slavery. There's no doubt about that. They eliminated slavery in 1831. So that was one issue. The other was they didn't really relate to the idea of union. The concept of union that advanced so eloquently by Abraham Lincoln was Great Britain or the United Kingdom was founded on history and traditions inherited over from the mists of time and an unwritten constitution. They didn't relate to a written constitution based on a single principle and a federal system. Federal system is not something they related to. So the concept of trying to preserve the Union just didn't click with them very much. And the other issue was that they were very proud of their empire, but they began to see that there were reasons for eventual colonial independence in a modern industrial and commercial world with the burgeoning world commerce was something that probably was justified. And the independence of the South American countries and Belgium, and they supported, and Greek independence, they supported those things. So to a large degree, many Brits bought the propaganda of the Confederates that they were just seeking independence. And what about slavery? But the Confederates said, oh, don't worry about slavery. We will end that in our own good time, in a right manner, and without sudden emancipation that would destroy the whole economy. And when the Brits freed their slaves in the Caribbean, it was an economic disaster. I mean, for them, political and economic, real problem. But they did it, and they did it for the right reasons, but it was very painful for them. So a lot of Brits were just very conflicted about the whole thing. And that's part of the reason that they allowed some of these things to go on as far as to help the Confederacy, but they never got to the point where they really wanted to intervene.
Take issue with that, but we'll go to the next question. Yes, sir.
I'm Ryan Mewett from Johns Hopkins University. I have a question for Neil and for Diana. For Neil, I'm interested in how both sides thought about this campaign, both the commerce rate effort and the effort to interdict the commerce raters, because as commerce rating campaigns go, this one seems to have been spectacularly unsuccessful. And I guess the point behind it is if you kind of hit the jackpot once or twice, then you're doing pretty well. But they managed one capture, even over the course of a long period of unescorted convoys. So I'm wondering how they thought about that, and did it register for them that there was a strategic and operational advantage to drawing Union ships into the protection campaign, even if they weren't making seizures? And on the other hand, how did the Union, did they consider that from a strategic perspective also? Did they think about the trade-offs to what they were doing to protect these when they had a lot of success, even when they weren't providing protection? And then if I could just ask the question for Diana as well, how did the United States, what was the scope of options for the United States in dealing with Britain in this affair? Because as you said, they're not particularly interested in going to war with Britain. They don't have the capacity for it. So is there really anything different that the United States government could have done other than push as much as they can? And when Britain ignores their push, they, it's dependent on everybody agreeing to the same set of rules. And so if you pretend that you continue to agree to the same set of rules, even as you don't, is there anything else the United States could have done?
All right, awesome questions. So as far as perceptions for the Confederacy, their traditional commerce raiding campaign of sending ships out and hunting merchant ships was a pretty successful organization overall. 10 or so commerce raiders captured hundreds of U.S. merchant ships and destroyed them or bonded them and so on. And that was a big PR victory, and it was also a big blow to the U.S. Merchant Marine. As far as Confederate perceptions of this specific element of their raiding campaign and plans, what's really interesting is that for the most part, citizens of the Confederacy didn't even know this was going on. They didn't know this was a thing. And the only time they found out about it was when a victory happened. And the newspaper said, oh, we've captured this ship and we've interrupted this trade route and we've done this. Whereas for the most part, with the traditional commerce raiding ideas, it was they would put things in the newspapers about, you never know where the Alabama is going to show up next. You never know where the Florida is going to show up. And this is the greatest thing on earth. The U.S. is stupid for trying to risk us on the oceans. But as far as this part, they never heard, oh, we're trying to intercept gold. The Confederacy didn't want the public to know this for a couple of reasons. One is because that means that they're acknowledging that the Confederacy has no treasury, because their treasury was $500,000 for the entire war, and that was it. So they're not trying to acknowledge weakness, and then when they make a victory or an attempt at a victory, or when they lose spectacularly, when their secret agents, naval agents in Panama get captured, or when a privateer in California gets captured before it even starts, and the U.S. makes a big propaganda push about it in the newspapers, that's when the public at large is hearing about it. But they're not really making connections of it's a bigger, wider campaign. It's more of treated as isolated incidents per se. As far as the United States and its perceptions, the biggest place where perceptions of this were was New York City. New York City and San Francisco, and that's because that's where it was the starting point and terminus of this whole area, of this whole effort. And so for the most part, what you see is the newspapers in New York and San Francisco are printing pretty consistently efforts about protecting these ships or efforts about what's going on overall. And that's a big thing. And to answer your question about the money figures, the projections of the money of costs and totals are in $1861 for the beginning for the cost and projections, but the totals of transports carried, that's the actual number according to the gold standard of that day in that newspaper. So it does have a lot of ebb and flow with that. As far as U.S. government and their perception of is this successful or not, the U.S. Navy neglected their convoys on this. they provided them, but in the Caribbean, there were 12 ships total that provided these escorts in the entire war out of 150 escort missions made. And what we see is that they neglected the ships. They did not replace them fast enough. They would basically be falling apart. Like most of the reports sent by the squadron commanders are, the ships are falling apart. Can you send me more, please? And Gideon Wells literally would tell the squadron commanders in writing, the blockade is the priority, you are not. And you get what we send you. And so they were cognizant of the fact that protection was important and that some protection was better than none. And so they would not send the best ships because the fastest ships in the US Navy were on the outer ring of the blockade to pursue Confederates that escaped the blockade or were coming in, so they could provide that mobile platform. So the perceptions can be pretty interesting just because some people weren't even aware of what was happening, and others were pretty cognizant of the fact that it was a secondary objective of the United States Navy, but one that the moment a Confederate victory happened on this avenue suddenly became a primary focus because of propaganda and because of economics. And then once things calmed down, it was a secondary objective again immediately. I'll pass it to you.
It's a great question. It is sort of what drew me to this in the first place, was kind of this question of why did Britain send 10,000 troops to Canada after the Trent affair? Like, what did they think was going to happen? And obviously they are afraid that the Union's going to invade Canada, but to me that just seemed like that all the forces, there's a war going on in the South, like why would you send your troops in all these different directions, right? So I hate to say, I think my answer here is I'm not actually sure what the Union's options were here. They sort of, it's interesting sort of reading this correspondence as Professor DeCardigo was saying. There is this ton of primary source documentation of sort of all of these threats that we're going to go to war with you, we're going to go to war with you. And essentially, it almost feels like the British read this as the Union is almost willing to commit suicide here. It is almost willing to just bring down the entire global trading system that's sort of in the process of forming here, if the British step out of line or sort of cross whatever this threshold is. So yes, so it's unclear to me sort of what specific things the Union was sort of suggesting it would do, because there's sort of a very limited amount of military force to go around, and initially, I guess, Britain thought the Union was going to lose. It thought this war was going to be over pretty quickly. The Confederates were going to win. After Manassas, they're sort of like, oh yeah, okay, this is basically over. This this big debate over recognition, right? Do we recognize the Confederacy as, in fact, a sovereign state within the system, or do we just sort of accept this, like, they might still get to that point, but we don't want to do it because they're going to declare war. And then I guess maybe as the war, as the Civil War sort of is unfolding, they start realizing that, oh, maybe this isn't quite as, cut and dry. Maybe we do have to worry about sort of the long-term economic relationship with the Union. So maybe we need to try and protect that. Maybe they can, instead of tariffs, they're going to do all this stuff, which they had been doing. The Union had increased its tariffs with Britain. So if anybody has a better answer, I'm certainly very interested in that. But because I think that's an important question of, why do you care if the United States is mad at you?
Wouldn't you say that the tensions were, after the Trent affair, really escalated? Absolutely, right. And in that moment, right, they're sort of, Britain is kind of looking at this and going, you guys need to solve this problem diplomatically because we might go to war with you. But they're also still angling to give them an out, right? Prince Albert is like his last, thing that he does is to massage this situation and be like, you didn't mean to do that, right? That guy was just sort of operating out of his own cognizance, right? And the Union goes, right, yeah, that's what we were doing, because nobody wants this war. Like the United States can't take on Britain; they don't want to do this. But they also are so
so desperate to maintain the Union, to win this Civil War, and to keep Britain out of it, that they are sort of playing in this space of, like, we will burn this down, whole world if we have to keep this from happening. So.
Yeah, you have to remember, in terms of the commerce raiders, it was not just the ships captured. There was something like 100,000 tons of shipping was sold by Yankee ship owners into neutral, so they could fly sail under neutral flags. And the Great Britain bought most of those. So practically the entire United States Merchant Marine was sold overseas. And that was the big impact. And the impact was that and psychological, particularly around New York. And of course, the folks in New York weren't crazy about, there were a lot of anti-war people and folks in New York anyway. So that was the big part of that problem.
Chris Hemler, U.S. Naval Academy. My question's for Lieutenant Commander Hughes. Thank you all for a terrific panel and excellent commentaries. It's just fascinating all around. For Lieutenant Commander Hughes, but perhaps responses from around the room, you suggest that the success at Vicksburg is really about temperament and kind of personal inclination, and you make a strong case there. Does the landscape matter? Does the military map? Because you talk about the struggles in '62. Does the map in the East matter? Does Lincoln's resolve matter? Do the politics matter, or is it really is there a sense of urgency for cooperation? I guess I'm asking. It's beyond the personalities that contribute here, or is it really, as you've suggested?
Well, yes, there were. I mean, all those factors mattered. The Commander-in-Chief wanted these officers to work together, or the Army and the Navy. The problem, and a number of the officers did too, some of them were more open to it than others. The problem was they'd never had any experience with it, and there weren't any mechanisms for doing it. And there was some real cultural clash between the two services. So as she mentioned, the Navy and the Army did get together at Hatteras Inlet and Port Royal, but those were fairly easy affairs. The big ships sailed in, they fired their guns a few times, and then the soldiers went ashore in boats. And so that was kind of the start of it. But the whole river environment was different. I mean, the Navy they weren't river sailors. And so they had to rely a lot on the local rivermen and to navigate the Mississippi, which is a very challenging maritime environment. And the boats are different, the naval architecture is different. And so they had to do some adaptation in order to do that. And one of Porter's strengths was that he adapted pretty quickly, and a couple of his predecessors did too. And we managed to build our first brown water Navy right from scratch with no experience, and did very well with it. But it was the personalities of the two was not the only factor, but it was certainly a major factor. And a lot of that was on Grant's part. There were a lot of Union generals that Porter would not have gotten along with, and there were other clashes between the admirals and generals that didn't work out as well. So, does that answer your question?
I'm thinking McClernand.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jason Smith, Southern Connecticut State University. My question is for Neil and for Dwight, and it revolves around protection sort of vital resources. So in Dwight's case, I'm wondering, where was the Navy's River Squadron coaling? Where were the coaling depots? Were they close by? Were they far upriver? And what was required for their protection from Confederate raiding? Was that something that factored into Porter and Grant's relationship? Was it incumbent upon Grant to protect those coaling stations for Porter's fleet? And then for Neil, was especially early in the war, was there any concern among the Union military political leadership or talk in the Confederacy about possibly seizing the Panama Railroad. I mean, I know that seems maybe like a far-fetched sort of idea, but it seemed like that's a critical point. I don't know how well defended that was, either by the Navy or by, I don't know who else, probably by the Navy, I guess. Was there any concern that that would be taken by the Confederacy?
When the Mississippi River Squadron first started, and it was not called that initially, it was the Western Gunboat Flotilla, yeah. Wells didn't, the Navy Secretary Wells didn't want anything to do with it. He said, okay, I'll send you a few officers as advisors, and I'll send you a few guns, but that's it. It's up to the rivers are not the Army's business. Rivers are not the Navy's business. We don't do rivers. That's the Army's business. And so the Army had to do everything: build the boats, supply them, man them, and so on. And the Navy slowly got involved, and the first great was Flag Officer Foote. He got together with Grant at Fort Donelson and Henry, and that's how things really started to click. And again, that was a personality connection between those two. And Foote just said, "What do you want me to do?" And I'll do it, and he did it. And then they went from there. And the whole fleet started sort of in Cincinnati. That's where a lot of the boats were converted, and some of the ironclads were built. And there wasn't any problem really. They did protect Cincinnati because that's where the Western Theater was headquartered. And then Cairo, Illinois, at the tip of Illinois, became the primary base for the Mississippi River Squadron. And yes, they protected that. The Army took responsibility for doing that. And as they went on down the Mississippi, and of course Grant, who among his many other accomplishments was a superb logistician, made sure that all that happened. So coal was always an issue, as it is with the steamboats, but the Army and but they had trouble getting the logistical infrastructures to work together because they hadn't done that before. But they accomplished it finally.
Before I get to mine, to add to that, the Confederates did make efforts to interdict U.S. supply stations on the Western waters. I mean, the Confederate Army in Arkansas attacks Helena, Arkansas on July 5th, 1863. That's one of the main supply routes for stockpiling supplies for the run down to Grant's army. And that attack fails, and it was kind of tried to be part of the relief efforts of Vicksburg. In 64, Nathan Bedford Forrest Cavalry captures Johnsonville, Tennessee, which is the main supply depot for U.S. forces in central Tennessee as part of John Bell Hood's attempted recapture of Tennessee at that point. So they made efforts to try and interdict these supply stations. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it never ultimately resulted in a strategic shift, except for the Holly Springs in 62, yeah, where he stopped Grant's falls move. Yes, and that just leaves Sherman for the Chickasaw Bayou campaign kind of alone. To get to the Panama Railroad part, the U.S. Navy protected the Panama Railroad not by approval from the United States of Colombia / the Grenadine Confederation / Nueva Granada, whatever the country termed itself. It changed its name 3 times during the Civil War. They kept U.S. naval ships at Colon, Panama / Aspinwall, and they kept U.S. naval ships at Panama City continuously throughout the war. There was at least one warship at either end of the Panama Railroad at all times to monitor, to provide protection for the inflow or outflow of American citizens and the gold and the silver and so on. In the 1850s, the U.S. Navy literally went ashore during one of these Colombian Civil Wars, where they changed their name, and provided protection to the railroad itself, because the railroad's operated by the Panama Railroad Company, which is owned by Cornelius Vanderbilt. I mean, it just keeps going like that. And so it's very much an American railroad company with American naval protection, and essentially this is another element of the U.S. and the Monroe Doctrine of just stiff arming local Latin American partners and saying, we're going to do this and deal with it. The Confederacy never tried to launch an effort to capture the railroad, mainly because that would then essentially declare war on Colombia at the time, and they're trying to avoid conflict. They're trying to get foreign recognition instead. So the closest they come to is using naval agents to use the railroad as transportation and to try and use that to jump off some certain campaigns, but they never made an effort to seriously control it physically.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, Michelle.
Sure, Sir Claus Hillary. My question is for you, Mr. Mayor. You mentioned that the South economically, or at least the Confederacy economically, was less of a threat if they were to pull away for Britain. Talk about the difference between the economy of North and how they were huge consumer base versus the Confederacy and their supply of cotton and how they could easily switch. So my question for you is what about the South, long-term, strategically, was so attractive to Britain that they were willing to subvert the law and help the Confederacy get
That's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah, so there's sort of, I mean, it all comes back to cotton, right? And so at the time the Civil War started, I want to say it was about 20% of the British economy is in some way linked to the import and processing and manufacture of textiles or of cotton into textiles, which is huge, right? Like 20% of your economy is based on this one product coming in and you processing it and all the second and third order elements of that, right? But they also needed somewhere to sell that stuff or to sell their products in general, which was in large part the Union, and it wasn't so they liked Southern cotton because it was cheap and it was good quality. It was cleaner. It was and obviously because the labor was free, they were like, oh, hey, it's cheap. Look at our cheap cotton. Okay, great. Well, you factored in cotton anyway. But they had another option, right? They had India. It was the quality of the cotton itself wasn't as good. It was a shorter fiber basically, and so it would produce more dust, and then the looms would break, and now you have these maintenance costs associated with processing it, and it's dirty, blah blah blah. But it's doable if you really had to. They had also before the war, there was a backlog essentially. The warehouses had sort of been filled up. The South had sort of flooded the market, and then Jefferson Davis was like, sell nothing else, and the mills in Liverpool were all like, cool, so now we can charge more for this product that we already have because we can claim scarcity of, we can just sort of like pocket all these profits, So Britain wasn't in 1861 immediately facing the effects of not getting more cotton in the door. That sort of crunch wasn't really going to come for a year or two. They kind of knew they had a little bit of space. France is actually a different story. They didn't have an alternate source of cotton, but we'll set them to the side for a moment. So Britain's sort of looking at this and going, okay, so right now we need to be able to continue trading with the North. We are able to sort of put a pause on trading with the South if we have to. However, long term, we would really like to go back to that, cheap cotton and good cotton, and if we could just kind of keep that going, that'd be great. So yeah, they also sort of had strategic reasons for wanting the Union to break apart, just because you don't want this competitor across the ocean, et cetera. But yeah, and the South was kind of banking on the cotton thing as their way of getting recognition. So they're like, we messed that up.
To add on to that, 60% of all U.S. exports in 1860 are cotton. It is the engine of the American economy. So that's why when James Henry Hammond said cotton is king, you dare not make war on it, he's not engaging in hyperbole, he means it. Yeah. This has been a wonderful session. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.